The night Kong Dojin chose to save another woman, he didn't know he was signing the death warrant on everything he loved. He didn't hesitate. That was the part that would haunt him. Not the choice itself, but the absence of doubt. 1 second, Avery Morgan was pinned beneath a collapsed beam, screaming his name through a wall of smoke. The next, his hands were on the steel, muscles burning, pulling with everything he had. He told himself Zuri was already outside. He'd seen her moving toward the exit. He was certain. He was wrong. By the time firefighters pulled the last survivor from the Imperium Seoul Hotel, Zuri Okafor, his wife, his compass, the woman who had quietly held his entire empire together while he took every credit, was gone. And the most feared man in Korea was standing in the rain, holding nothing but her wedding ring. If that were you, if the person you loved most in the world vanished the moment you looked away to save someone else, what would you do with the rest of your life? Don't go anywhere. Stay with this story until the very end, because what happens next will shake you. If this kind of story moves you, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss what's coming. The gala had started the way those events always did. Too much champagne, too many handshakes that meant nothing, and lighting so soft it made everyone look like they'd never done anything wrong in their lives. Zuri stood near the far end of the ballroom, holding a glass of water she hadn't touched, listening to a retired judge talk about his grandchildren with the kind of pride that made her chest ache in a quiet way. She was good at that. Listening. She had built an entire career out of it, though almost nobody in that room knew it. They saw Dojin's wife. They saw the elegant black woman in the midnight blue dress who smiled at the right moments and never said anything controversial. They assumed she was decoration. They had been assuming that for 6 years, and for 6 years she had let them. It was easier that way. Easier for Dojin's position. Easier for the work she did in the background where nobody was watching. Dojin was across the room, talking to a city council member whose face she recognized from 3 different files she'd reviewed that month. She caught his eye for a second, just a second, and he tilted his head slightly, the private signal they'd developed somewhere around year 2 of the marriage. "You okay?" She gave him the smallest nod. "Fine, go." That was the last real conversation they had before the lights went out. It didn't start dramatically. That was the thing nobody ever mentioned afterward. How ordinary the beginning of a catastrophe could feel. A flicker. A strange smell that took 3 or 4 seconds to identify as smoke. Then someone near the kitchen entrance said fire in a voice that wasn't quite panicked yet, just confused, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath for one suspended moment before everything collapsed into chaos. The sprinkler system failed in the East Wing. The emergency lighting kicked on in some sections and not others, which meant half the ballroom was in near darkness, and 500 people who had been drinking expensive wine for 2 hours suddenly had to navigate their way out of a space designed to be disorienting even under perfect conditions. Zuri moved toward the main exit with the crowd, keeping her hand on the wall, counting door frames the way she always counted them in any new space, a habit she'd developed years ago, before Dojin, before Seoul, when she'd done her first security assessment of a building in Lagos, and her supervisor had told her that knowing your exits by feel could save your life. She'd rolled her eyes at the time. She remembered that now. She was maybe 40 feet from the main exit when she heard it, a sound that cut straight through the noise of the crowd, through the alarms, through the rush of blood in her own ears. A child. Not screaming, coughing, the kind of cough that meant the smoke had already gotten low. She stopped. The crowd moved around her like water around a stone, people pressing toward the exit without looking sideways. A man in a tuxedo hit her shoulder hard enough to spin her half around and didn't stop. She caught herself against the wall and looked toward the sound. Down a side corridor, one of the service hallways she'd noted when they arrived because she always noted service hallways, there was a shape on the floor, small. Then another shape beside it, larger, slower. An elderly woman, maybe 70, trying to lift a child who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. They'd come from somewhere, maybe a private dining room, maybe just gotten turned around in the darkness, and now they were moving the wrong direction, toward the back of the building where the smoke was thickest. Zuri didn't think about Dojin in that moment. She would think about that later, not with guilt exactly, but with a kind of wonder at how completely the brain could simplify itself in a crisis. There was a woman and a child moving the wrong way. She was between them and the right way. That was the entire calculation. She went toward them. Getting them turned around took longer than it should have. The elderly woman, Mrs. Park, she would learn the name much later, though it wouldn't matter for a long time, was disoriented and kept pulling toward where she thought the exit was, which was exactly wrong. The child, a boy, had stopped coughing and gone quiet in a way that was more frightening than the coughing. Zuri got low, got her arm around Mrs. Park, got moving. She didn't see the ceiling panel give way. It wasn't a collapse, not the dramatic kind, just a section of acoustic tile soaked through with water from the broken sprinkler, heavy enough to swing down and clip her across the left side of her head with the metal bracket still attached. She went down on one knee, got back up. The world had a strange tilt to it that she told herself would pass. It didn't pass, but she got them to the exit. She remembered the door. She remembered the cold air. She didn't remember much after that. Meanwhile, Dojin had been in the north section of the ballroom when the smoke hit, moving toward where he'd last seen Zuri, fighting the current of the crowd that was moving in the opposite direction. His security detail, two men named Hyun and Daisik, who had been with the syndicate for 11 years, were already at his sides, trying to get him toward the main exit. "Zuri," he said. Not a question, an instruction. "Sir, we need to find her." Hyun broke left. Daisik stayed with Dojin, who was not moving toward any exit. He was scanning the room with the kind of flat, methodical focus that people who'd never seen him work always mistook for coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was what happened when he locked every other thing down so there was room to think. He spotted Avery Morgan by accident, turned his head to check a doorway, and there she was, a beam across her legs. One of the emergency exit signs collapsed on top of it, and she was not quiet about it. She was saying his name, which meant she'd seen him, which meant she was conscious, which meant she had a real chance if someone moved the beam in the next few minutes before the smoke got worse. Dojin had known Avery Morgan for 4 years. She was a business contact, nothing more, though Seoul's rumor circuit had decided otherwise on at least 3 occasions because she was attractive and ambitious, and people liked that story better than the boring truth. He did not like her particularly. He respected her competence. At that moment, none of that was relevant. What was relevant was that she was going to die if nobody helped her, and he was the person standing there. "Zuri went to the east exit," Hyun said in his earpiece, slightly breathless. "I think I saw her." "She's out, sir." She was moving toward the courtyard. Dojin heard this. He processed it. Zuri was out. Zuri was safe. That was the fact he had, and he built everything that came after on top of it. He moved to Avery Morgan and started working on the beam. It took 6 minutes. He counted, because counting kept him from thinking about the smoke or the way the ceiling above them was making sounds it shouldn't. And Daisik helped with the last section, and when they got Avery clear, she was crying and grabbing at his jacket and saying thank you in a way that was going to create exactly the kind of story he hated. He didn't care about that either. He got her to the exit. Outside, the courtyard was chaos. Firefighters arriving, ambulances, hotel staff trying to organize people into groups, guests sitting on the ground in formal wear with their shoes off. Dojin moved through it looking for one face. He didn't find it. Hyun was already scanning. Daisik was on the phone. Dojin checked every cluster of people in the courtyard, then the side street, then the emergency triage area the paramedics had set up near the gate. He checked twice. He went back and checked a third time. "She came out the east exit," Hyun said. He no longer sounded certain. "You said you saw her." "I saw a woman in a dark blue dress. I thought—" Hyun stopped. Dojin looked at him. "You thought." Hyun didn't answer. He went back to the hotel entrance before the fire crews could stop him, which required getting past 2 firefighters in a way that he would not describe to anyone later, and he made it 20 feet inside before the smoke drove him back. He stood at the threshold and shouted her name into the building. The sound came back wrong, swallowed by noise and heat, and there was nothing on the other side of it. By midnight, when they'd finally cleared the building, they had 4 casualties confirmed and 11 people unaccounted for. By 2 a.m., that number was down to 3. By 4 a.m., it was 1. A rescue worker found Zuri's wedding ring in the service corridor near the east wing, the same corridor, though Dojin didn't know it yet, where she'd gone to help Mrs. Park and the boy. The ring was beside a section of fallen ceiling panel. There was blood on the bracket. The worker who found it walked across the courtyard to where Dojin had been standing motionless for 2 hours and held it out without saying anything. There wasn't anything to say. Dojin looked at the ring for a long time before he took it. He turned it over once in his fingers. The inside of the band had an inscription, "Always beside you," because Zuri had insisted on inscriptions, and he'd argued it was sentimental, and she'd looked at him with that particular expression that meant, "You're being an idiot," and he'd agreed to the inscription. He closed his fingers around it. He did not cry. That would come later, alone, in the penthouse where her books were still stacked on her nightstand, and her handwriting was still on the notepad by the kitchen phone. In public, in front of his men, in front of the firefighters and police officers who were starting to look at him with the particular expression of people who were about to say something they'd rehearsed, he did not cry. He said very quietly to Dasik, "She's not dead." Dasik was a careful man. He said nothing. "She's not dead," Dojin said. And it didn't sound like denial exactly. It sounded like the beginning of a decision. The police would conduct their investigation. They would find inconsistencies in the hotel's safety systems. A generator improperly maintained, an alarm that had been flagged for repairs 6 months earlier and never fixed. They would issue reports. They would close the active search in 11 weeks. Dojin would not close anything. But that night, standing in the gray pre-dawn outside the ruins of what had been the Imperium Sol's East Corridor, holding a ring that had been cut from someone's finger by a ceiling bracket, he didn't yet know everything that was coming. The rumors, the investigation, the discovery of what Zuri had actually been doing for 6 years behind the quiet face she wore at Gallus. He didn't know what he was going to find in her files, or in the testimony of people who'd worked alongside her in ways he'd never thought to ask about. He only knew she wasn't dead. He didn't know yet that she was waking up in a field hospital 20 miles away, in a borrowed shirt, with no memory of her own name. The ring was cold in his hand. He put it in his jacket pocket, against his chest, and stood there while the sun came up over Seoul and painted everything in a light that felt completely inappropriate for the occasion. Around him, people were already starting to talk. He could hear fragments, the name Avery Morgan, the phrase "he saved her first," the specific register of gossip that presents itself as concern. He heard it, and he filed it away in the part of his mind that cataloged threats, because that was what it was, even if nobody else recognized it yet. His wife was somewhere. She was alive. He was going to find her. That was the only thing that was going to matter for a very long time. And the city, watching him stand there in his smoke-stained jacket with his face like carved stone, thought it knew the story already. Thought it understood what kind of man he was. It didn't know the first thing about him. And neither, it would turn out, did he. 11 weeks. That was how long the Seoul Metropolitan Police kept Zuri Okafor's case open as an active missing persons investigation before a detective named Woo Sang-hyun filed the paperwork to move it to a cold case status. 11 weeks was apparently the threshold at which a missing woman with no recovered body, no confirmed witnesses to her final moments, and no ransom demand became, administratively speaking, a lower priority than the 47 other open cases on Woo's desk. Dojin found out about the reclassification from Dasik, who found out from a contact inside the precinct, who found out 40 minutes before the paperwork was formally processed. By the time Woo Sang-hyun finished his coffee the next morning and arrived at his desk, there was an envelope waiting for him. Not a threat, nothing so crude, just a single sheet of paper with a meeting time and an address written in handwriting that was precise enough to be unsettling. Woo came to the meeting. He was not a stupid man. He sat across from Dojin in the back room of a restaurant that was technically closed on Tuesdays, and he kept his hands flat on the table because he'd heard enough about Kang Dojin to know that visible hands were a form of respect in this particular context. "You're closing the case," Dojin said, "reclassifying. It's procedural. We have no—" "I didn't ask you to explain the procedure." Woo went quiet. "I want to know what you haven't told me," Dojin said. "Not what's in the report, what's not in it." The detective looked at his hands. He was maybe 50, the kind of 50 that came from bad hours and too much instant food, with the permanent squint of a man who'd stopped expecting good outcomes. He said after a long pause, "There were 2 volunteer shuttles that evacuated from the East Service exit during the fire. The hotel logged one. The other was an unofficial vehicle. A private bus. Someone's church group that had been at an adjacent event. They left before anyone could get their information. We traced the plate 6 weeks later. The driver died in a separate accident in Incheon before we could interview him. Dojin didn't move. We have no confirmed record of who was on that second shuttle, Wu said. But we have a partial passenger list from survivors who remembered seeing each other. Your wife's name is not on it. He paused. Her description matches 2 of the unidentified passengers. The room was very quiet. You buried this, Dojin said. We couldn't confirm. You buried it, Dojin said again, and his voice had not changed volume or register at all, which was somehow worse than if it had. A lead that points away from the building, away from a confirmed death, away from every assumption your report is based on, and you buried it because confirming it would mean reopening a case you've already decided you don't have resources for. Wu's jaw tightened. That's not... I'm going to need everything, Dojin stood. Every note, every photograph, every piece of physical evidence your team cataloged from the East Corridor. Not copies, everything. I can't give you... Wu! Dojin looked at him the way people described but could never quite convey accurately. Not with anger, not with menace in any theatrical sense, just with a quality of absolute certainty that made the air in the room feel different. Your daughter is enrolled at Yonsei, second year, architecture program. You're 3 payments behind on the apartment in Mappo. I know these things not because I've been watching you, but because I know things about everyone in this city who touches anything I care about. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. You have until Thursday. He walked out. Dasik was waiting in the car. He didn't ask how it went because the answer was already on Dojin's face. Not satisfaction, nothing close to it. Just the flat determination of a man who had identified the next problem and was already calculating how to move through it. Get me Young-woo, Dojin said, and pull everything we have on disaster relief routing from the night of the fire. Every hospital, every clinic, every field triage station within 50 kilometers. That's already been, do it again, differently. We've been looking for a woman named Zuri Okafor. Start looking for a Jane Doe who came in from the East Corridor with head trauma and no identification. Dasik made the call. The syndicate's operations continued without Dojin's active management in ways that would have been impossible 2 years earlier, which was itself a testament to something he wasn't ready to examine yet. The Baeko Syndicate's organizational structure had a quality of self-sufficiency that Dojin had always attributed to his own design. The hierarchy, the distribution of authority, the contingency protocols. It ran smoothly in his absence. He told himself this meant his system worked. He would find out later, going through Zuri's files, that he had it significantly wrong. The files were in her home office, a room he'd walked past hundreds of times and entered maybe a dozen, mostly to tell her dinner was ready or ask if she'd seen his keys. It was a small room by the standards of the penthouse, orderly in a way that was slightly different from the orderliness of the rest of the apartment, which had the impersonal cleanliness of professional housekeeping. Her office was organized by a specific intelligence, things grouped not by category but by relationship, by how they connected to each other, in a system that took him 3 days to begin to understand. He found the first set of documents by accident. I was looking for her insurance records, practical, necessary, the kind of administrative grief that nobody warns you about. And he opened the wrong drawer and found a file labeled with the name of a man Dojin had considered his most successful independent recruitment of the past 4 years. A lieutenant named Baek Sung-min, whose instincts for supply chain management had quietly tripled the syndicate's logistics efficiency. The file was 4 inches thick. Zuri's handwriting was on the first page. Not notes. A full assessment dated 18 months before Dojin had ever heard Baek Sung-min's name. She had identified him, researched him, mapped his professional history, and written a 7-page recommendation that included a psychological profile and a suggested approach strategy. The final line read, "Present this as your own discovery. He'll respond better to you directly. I'll brief you on the approach before the first meeting." Dojin sat on the floor of her office with the file in his hands and stayed there for a while. He went through everything after that. It took him 3 weeks, working 4 to 6 hours a day, alongside everything else. And by the end of it, he had a picture of his own organization that looked almost nothing like the one he'd been carrying in his head. The financial restructuring from 2021 that he'd credited to his own instincts about market timing, Zuri had drafted the entire model 6 weeks before he'd announced the decision, and the draft was in her handwriting with margin notes that matched, almost word for word, the plan he'd presented to his inner circle as his own thinking. He hadn't been lying. She'd discussed it with him, casually, over dinner, over the course of several conversations that he'd experienced as his wife being interested in his work. He hadn't registered that he'd been receiving a briefing. The letters were the hardest part. There were dozens of them, addressed to mid-level syndicate members, to families of men who'd been arrested, to the wives of soldiers who'd died in territorial disputes. They were in Zuri's handwriting, unsigned in most cases, and they ranged from practical support, resources, contacts, legal referrals, to something that functioned more like pastoral care, written in a register that was warm and direct without being sentimental. She had written, in one letter to a woman whose husband had been jailed, "He made choices that had consequences, and you're carrying them, and that's not right. It's also just true. Both of those things can be true at once." Dojin read that letter 3 times. He was sitting at her desk when Hyun knocked and opened the door without waiting, which was a bad sign. Hyun always waited. "There's a situation," Hyun said. The situation was Choi Byung-kwan, who ran the Baeko Syndicate's Western Territory operations, and who had, in the 11 weeks since the fire, developed a theory that Dojin's preoccupation with finding his missing wife represented a leadership vacuum that Byung-kwan might usefully fill. He hadn't done anything overt yet. He'd had 3 meetings with people he shouldn't have been meeting with, and he'd restructured 2 revenue streams in ways that technically fell within his authority, but that didn't require authorization he normally would have sought. Dojin knew all of this. He'd known it for 2 weeks. "He's moved faster," Hyun said. "He's talking to the Haedong crew." The Haedong crew was a rival organization, not large but strategically positioned, and their willingness to talk to Byung-kwan meant Byung-kwan had told them something worth hearing. That was the escalation. That was the thing that required a response that couldn't be deferred. Dojin closed Zuri's file. He set it on the desk with both hands, very precisely, the way you set something down when you need to put it somewhere safe. "Call Byung-kwan," Dojin said. "Tell him I want to meet. Tonight, the usual place." Hyun hesitated. "Sir, I know what you're going to say. You haven't slept more than 4 hours consecutively in 2 months. Your focus is Hyun. Compromised, and walking into a room with Byung-kwan when you're not. Hyun." Dojin looked at him. "Make the call." The meeting was at a private club in Gangnam, in a room with sound dampening and no recording equipment, which was a standard precaution that both parties observed as a professional courtesy. Byung-kwan arrived with 2 men and the kind of careful ease that people perform when they've been rehearsing their composure all afternoon. He was 52, heavyset, with the specific physical authority of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where physical authority mattered. He'd been with the Baeko organization for 19 years. He had, once, been someone Dojin trusted. "You look tired," Byung-kwan said. "Sit down." They sat. The 2 men positioned themselves near the wall. Dasik stood near the door. There was a bottle of whiskey on the table that neither of them touched. "The Haedong crew," Dojin said. Byung-kwan's expression moved very slightly. Not guilt exactly, more like the recalculation of a man who'd expected more preamble. "I've had preliminary conversations about a potential arrangement that could. You had 3 meetings, in 2 weeks. On the day after the 3rd meeting, their territory protocol changed in 3 specific ways that only make sense if they've been told something concrete about our Western operations." Dojin's hands were flat on the table. He was very still. "So let's not do the preliminary conversations version. Tell me what you told them." Byung-kwan leaned back very slightly. He was reading the room, reading Dojin, doing the math that men like him always did in moments like this. He said, "The organization is losing ground, not operationally. The operations are fine. But the leadership signal is gone. You've been absent in every way that matters for 3 months. Men are nervous. They need to see something. So you showed them something. I started a conversation." "You started a negotiation," Dojin said, "with a crew that has been looking for a foothold in our Western territory for 4 years. You handed them one. With our logistics information, which you used as proof of value, Which I know because Heidong's procurement patterns changed the week after your second meeting in ways that only make sense if they know something about our supply chain they didn't know before. Byung-kwan's jaw set. He'd stopped performing composure. I've given 19 years to this organization. I know. 19 years. And in 3 months you've been... He stopped himself, recalibrated. The men are not wrong to be nervous. No, Dojin said. They're not. He looked at Byung-kwan for a moment. She's not dead. The non sequitur landed strangely. Byung-kwan blinked. Zuri, she's not dead. Dojin's voice was the same as it had been for the entire conversation. Controlled, precise, not particularly loud. I know what you all think. I know what the rumor is. I know half the organization believes I'm losing my mind over a woman who's gone, and I need to accept it and move on. He picked up the whiskey glass, looked at it, set it back down without drinking. I'm telling you she's not dead because it's true, and because I need you to understand something. What I'm doing right now, looking for her, that's not weakness. That's the only thing in my life right now that I'm completely certain about. Byung-kwan said nothing. Everything else I'm less certain about than I was 4 months ago, Dojin continued, including some things I should have been less certain about a long time ago. He looked at his own hands on the table. So let me ask you something honestly. The Heidong conversations, is it too late to pull them back? Byung-kwan didn't answer immediately. This was, Dojin recognized, the most honest version of the man he'd probably ever seen, stripped of the performance, not sure which direction was safe. Not completely, Byung-kwan said finally. If I end it now, it's a dead lead for them. They don't have enough to move on yet. Then end it. And what do I tell the men? About the organization? About what direction? I'll address the men myself, Dojin said. Tomorrow. Every division head in person. Byung-kwan studied him. And about the Western Territory operations? You still run them, Dojin said. But you report to DASIC directly until I tell you otherwise. Every decision, every contact, every meeting, all of it goes through him first. It was a demotion without being called one. Byung-kwan heard it perfectly. His face went through something complicated and came out the other side at a kind of resigned acceptance. The expression of a man who'd gambled on a read that had turned out to be slightly wrong. Fine, he said. Good. Dojin stood. The 19 years are real, Byung-kwan. I know what you've done for this organization, but if you run this play again, if you have one more meeting I haven't authorized with anyone outside our structure, I won't give you a second conversation. He left before Byung-kwan could respond. In the car, DASIC said nothing for 2 full minutes. Then, that was cleaner than I expected. It was the worst possible outcome, Dojin said. DASIC looked at him. Byung-kwan does what he's told now because I called his bluff and he wasn't ready. But I've shown weakness. Not to him. He already knew. To Heidong. They know we had an internal conversation, which means they know there's a fracture. A managed fracture, but still. Dojin looked out the window at the city going past. We'll have 3 months before that becomes a real problem. And in 3 months? Either I found her or I haven't. He said it like a logical statement, not an emotional one. The break in the case came from a direction nobody had been looking. An ex-hotel employee, a floor supervisor named Oh Gyung-soo, who had been quietly let go from the Imperium Seoul 6 months before the fire due to a pension dispute, contacted Dojin's legal team through a lawyer he'd hired specifically for the purpose, which meant he'd been sitting on whatever he knew long enough to get professional advice about it. He was 61 years old, recently divorced, and had the particular righteousness of someone who felt the world owed him a reckoning. He said he had information about the East Corridor. He said he wanted to tell his story. Dojin met him in a law office in Jongno, neutral territory, with a notary present and a recorder running at Oh Gyung-soo's own request. The man was not nervous. He was, if anything, almost peaceful. The way people sometimes get when they've made a decision they've been avoiding for too long, and the relief of deciding outweighs the consequences. I was the supervisor for the East Wing that night, Oh said. I'd stayed late for the gala setup. We were short-staffed. When the fire started, I was in the service corridor. I saw your wife. Dojin's hands were under the table. He pressed them against his thighs. She came down the corridor from the south end. She wasn't running. She was moving deliberately. She had a child under one arm, helping an elderly woman with the other. The smoke was already bad in that section. She got them to the emergency door, got it open. O paused. There was a ceiling panel that came down. It hit her. The bracket caught her on the left side. She went to her knee. He demonstrated the position briefly with his own body. She got up. She got both of them through the door. You saw her go through the door, Dojin said. I saw her get them through. Then she went back. O looked at him directly. Back into the corridor, there was a sound. Someone else, I think. Another voice somewhere further back. She went toward it. And you... I went for the exit, O said, and he said it without flinching, which somehow made it worse. I'm telling you that directly. I was 60 years old with a bad knee, and the smoke was... I went for the exit. I've thought about it every day since. The room was very quiet. She didn't come back out that corridor, O said, but I don't think she died in it either. That section of the building didn't collapse for another 40 minutes. There were other exits, the north-facing utility door, the external stairwell. She could have gotten out a different way. With the chaos outside, with no identification, he spread his hands. She could have been put on any transport. She could have been anywhere. Dojin realized he hadn't breathed properly in several minutes. He made himself breathe. You're telling me she went back in voluntarily, he said, to help someone else? Yes. After being hit in the head? Yes. He thought about the inscription on the ring, always beside you. He thought about the letters in her file, the ones written to people she'd never met. The 7-page assessment of a man she'd identified and researched so that the syndicate would have what it needed. He thought about 6 years of dinners where he'd thought she was interested in his work. He thought about how thoroughly he had underestimated the person he had been sleeping beside for 6 years. Where's the exit? Dojin asked. The north-facing utility door. Where does it come out? Loading dock on the north street level. The volunteer staging area for the evacuation was right outside. He was already reaching for his phone. The volunteer shuttle records took 4 days to pull together because the disaster relief coordination for the Imperium Seoul fire had been split between 3 different municipal departments and a private emergency management firm, and nobody had done a complete cross-reference. Dojin's people did it in 4 days because Dojin told them they had 4 days. The second shuttle, the one the police had logged but never fully traced, the church group's private bus, had originated from a volunteer coordination point at a community center in Mapo. The center had records, handwritten sign-in sheets, the kind that seemed almost quaint in the context of a major disaster, but that somebody had preserved in a file cabinet because the center director was 83 years old and had never trusted digital records. There was a name on the list. Not Zuri's name. A notation in the margin of the sign-in sheet, in different handwriting from the rest. A health worker's note, the kind you write when someone is too disoriented to sign themselves in. Female, approx. 35 to 40. Head injury, no identification. Responsive. Transported to Chungmu Medical Center per volunteer coordinator. Chungmu Medical Center was a small regional hospital 60 kilometers southeast of Seoul. It had been part of the disaster relief network for the fire, accepting overflow patients from the city hospitals. It had processed, according to its records, 47 fire-related admissions in the 72 hours following the disaster. Dojin had Dasik on the phone before he finished reading the document. Chungmu Medical Center, I need their Jane Doe admissions from the week of the fire. I need it tonight. They won't release. Find whoever needs to be found. Tonight, Dasik. There was a pause. Yes, sir. Dojin stood in the middle of his wife's office with the sign-in sheet photograph on his phone screen and the ring on his finger where he'd started wearing it 2 months ago because he didn't know what else to do with it. And he felt something that wasn't quite hope yet, because hope required a margin of error he couldn't afford. But it wasn't what it had been either. It wasn't the gray static of the first 11 weeks. Dasik called back in 3 hours. His voice was careful, controlled, the way it got when he was managing his own reaction to something. There was a Jane Doe admitted to Chungmu the morning after the fire. Female, mid-30s, head injury consistent with blunt trauma, significant short-term memory loss. No identification. She was held for 4 weeks while they tried to trace her through normal channels. When nothing came back, he paused. She was discharged into the care of a volunteer social worker and transferred to an outpatient program in a coastal district. The social worker's notes say she was calm, functional, helpful with other patients. but she had no memory of her own name. Dojin's hand was very tight around the phone. "The outpatient program," he said. "Where?" "A place called Haidam Village, South Chungcheong Province. About 180 kilometers. I know where South Chungcheong is." I was already moving toward the door. "Sir." Dasik's voice stopped him. Not the word. The tone. "The social worker's file has a note. 6 weeks ago, the woman started volunteering at a local children's literacy program. The note describes her as settled, happy. She's..." Another pause. "She's built a life there. She doesn't remember Seoul. She doesn't remember the syndicate or the fire or..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the end of it was in the air, or you. Dojin stood in the doorway of Zuri's office. Behind him, her books on the shelf, her handwriting on the notepad, the file of a man she'd found for him before he'd known to look. In front of him, a hallway, and beyond it, 180 kilometers. And at the end of that, a woman who had gone back into a burning building for a stranger and come out the other side as someone new. He said very quietly, "Get the car." Dojin, it was the first time Dasik had used his name without the honorific in 11 years. "What are you going to do when you get there?" He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the ring on his finger. The inscription faced inward, the way Zuri had insisted, because she'd said it was for them, not for display. What he was going to do when he got there was the question he'd been carrying for 11 weeks without an answer, and standing in this doorway with Dasik's voice in his ear and the specific weight of what he'd read in her files and what Oh Gyung-soo had told him and what the social worker's note said about a woman who was settled and happy and living a life built from nothing in a coastal village, he understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel in its precision, that there was no version of this where he could simply arrive and make it right. He had spent 3 months looking for his wife. He had not, until this moment, fully confronted what finding her might actually require of him. "Get the car," he said again, and walked out of the office and did not look back. The drive to Haidam Village took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Dojin sat in the back of the car and did not sleep, and did not look at his phone, and did not speak. Dasik drove. The city fell away behind them, and the road got narrower and the sky got darker, and somewhere around the 90-minute mark. The ocean appeared on the left side. Just a gray suggestion of it at first, a different quality of darkness at the horizon, and then more definitively, the smell of it coming through the ventilation, salt and cold, and something that had no name. Dojin looked at it. He had not been to the coast in 4 years. Zuri had asked him, twice, to take a weekend somewhere with water, somewhere that wasn't Seoul, somewhere the phones could be justified as unnecessary. He had said yes both times and canceled both times within a week of the date because something had come up that couldn't wait, and she had said fine both times in a voice that meant fine, and he had believed her both times because it was easier. He looked at the ocean going past and did not let himself think about that too long. Haidam Village was smaller than he'd expected from the name. It had the particular quality of a place that had decided not to grow, not declined, not failed, just quietly elected to remain itself. There were fishing boats. There was a covered market that was closed at this hour, its metal shutters salt-pitted and old. There were houses set into the hillside above the harbor with lights in their windows, the kind of lights that meant families inside, dinner finished, someone watching something on a small television. Dasik pulled the car to a stop on the main road and looked at him. "The social worker's name is Min Jong-hee," Dasik said. "She lives above the pharmacy on the East End. She's the one who filed the transfer paperwork." "Not tonight," Dojin said. "Sir, not tonight." He looked at the village, at the lit windows, at the harbor where the boats moved slightly against their moorings in the dark. "Which house?" "I don't think—" "Dasik." He turned to look at him directly. "Which house?" Dasik was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and read an address from his notes. "Third house from the top on the western path above the harbor. Blue shutters. She rented it from a fishing family who'd moved to Incheon 2 years ago." Dojin got out of the car. He walked up the western path alone. It was cold, the real cold of a coastal autumn night, and he hadn't brought a coat that was adequate for it, and he didn't care. His dress shoes made a sound on the stone path that seemed too loud for the quietness of the village. He passed the second house, where a dog barked once behind a gate and then went silent. and then he could see the third house and its blue shutters and the light in the window on the left side. He stopped on the path. The light moved, not the light itself, but something in front of it, a shadow crossing the window from left to right, a person moving inside, moving easily, unhurried, the movement of someone who felt safe in the space they were in. He stood on the path for a long time, long enough that his feet started to feel the cold through his shoes, long enough that the light in the window changed quality, softened. She'd turned off one lamp, was moving toward sleep. He did not knock on the door. He went back down the path to the car and got in and sat there, and Dasik did not say anything at all, which was the right call. "Tomorrow," Dojin said finally. "The social worker first." Min Jong-hee was 44 years old and had the particular wariness of someone who worked in social services and had learned that people with money and purpose showing up unannounced rarely made her caseload simpler. She opened her door at 7:30 in the morning, looked at Dojin, looked at Dasik, looked back at Dojin, and said, "I know who you are." "Then you know why I'm here." "Come in." She stepped back. "But I want to be clear before you say anything. Whatever you decide to do, I need you to hear me first." They sat at her kitchen table. She made tea without asking if they wanted it and set it down and sat across from them with her hands around her own cup and her eyes very steady. "She came to us through the Disaster Relief Network," Min said. "She was brought in by a volunteer from the second shuttle, an older woman named Mrs. Park, who said she'd helped her out of the building. The woman we received had a significant head injury, confusion, no identification. She was conscious, cooperative, physically intact except for the head trauma and some smoke inhalation. The memory loss, Dojin said, retrograde amnesia, partial but substantial. She retained language, functional skills, general knowledge. She knew how to read, how to cook, how to interact socially. She simply had no access to her personal history, her name, her relationships, where she was from, all of it." Min looked at her tea. "She was remarkably calm about it. That struck everyone who worked with her. She didn't become distressed. She just started from where she was." "How long before you tried to trace her identity?" "We filed a report with the Municipal Missing Persons Coordination Center within 48 hours of admission. We filed a follow-up at 2 weeks. At 4 weeks, we were told there were no matches in the database." She paused. "Your wife's file had been logged under a different regional code because of the way the Imperium case was split across jurisdictions. There was a cross-reference error. Our inquiry never hit her file." Dojin said nothing. The bureaucratic specificity of it, a cross-reference error, a jurisdictional split, sat in the room like something heavy. "She was ready to move to outpatient care by week 4, Min continued. "She was functioning well. She wanted to be useful. She kept asking what she could do to help at the center with other patients. We found her a placement here. Temporary, we thought." She looked up. "That was 7 months ago." "The literacy program," Dojin said. Min's expression shifted slightly, something protective moving through it. "She started that herself. She saw the children in the village and she asked the school if she could help. Within 6 weeks, she'd organized a full after-school reading program, gotten book donations from 3 different sources, and trained 2 local mothers to co-facilitate." She paused. "She's very good at seeing what a system needs and building it." The last part landed without Min intending it as anything specific, but Dojin heard it the way you hear something that's true in 2 directions at once. "I need to see her," he said. "I know." Min looked at him steadily. "And I need to ask you something first. What are you going to do when you do?" "Tell her the truth." "All of it? Immediately?" He opened his mouth and closed it again. This was the question he hadn't answered for Dasik in the hallway of her office, and he still didn't have a clean answer for it now. He had imagined this moment. Not consciously, he didn't have the habit of imagining things, but in the undefined space of nights when sleep didn't come, he had returned to this moment, to what he would say when he found her. And in those half-formed versions, she had always known him. There had always been recognition. Min watched him work through it. She was, he realized, not unsympathetic. She was just clear-eyed in a way that his own people hadn't been able to afford to be with him for months. "She's not the woman you were looking for," Min said. Not cruelly, precisely. "She's someone who began from the point of the fire and has built forward from there. She's happy. Genuinely, not performatively. And she has no framework right now for processing what she was before because she has no access to it. She set her cup down. If you walk in and tell her she's the wife of a crime syndicate head, you will not be giving her back her life. You will be handing her a stranger's identity and asking her to feel things for it. Dojin looked at the table, a scratch on the surface, long and old, probably from a piece of furniture being moved. He traced it with his eyes without reaching for it. "What are you suggesting?" he said. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what she is right now so that whatever you decide it with accurate information." Min stood and picked up her cup. "The reading program runs every weekday at 2. It's held in the old net house at the end of the harbor. She'll be there today." She looked at him over her shoulder. "The rest is yours to figure out." He was at the harbor by 1:30. He stood near the water on the opposite end from the net house, far enough away to be unremarkable. A man standing at the waterfront, nothing notable about it. The harbor smelled of fuel and brine and the specific animal smell of fishing equipment that gets into wood and stays there forever. At 2:05, she came down the path from the western hill. He had looked at her photograph approximately 300 times in the past 3 months. He had her face memorized in the precise, desperate way that loss creates. Every detail over-sharpened, almost inaccurate in its intensity. The way a word repeated too many times stops sounding like itself. She was wearing a dark green jacket he didn't recognize, something she'd bought here, something that had no history with him. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder full of what looked like books. She was walking quickly, the walk of someone who was already thinking about what they were going to do when they arrived, and she was talking to someone beside her, a young woman, local by the look of her, and she was laughing about something, a real laugh, unguarded. He had not expected the laugh. He stood absolutely still while she walked past on the other side of the harbor road, maybe 30 meters away, and went into the net house without looking in his direction. The young woman followed her in. The door closed. Dojin breathed. He sat on a mooring post and looked at the water and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has just seen the full scale of a problem they'd been approximating, that Min Jong-hee had been exactly right. The woman he had just watched cross the harbor was not performing wellness or performing recovery. She was genuinely, thoroughly, presently alive in a way that had nothing to do with him, nothing to do with Seoul or the syndicate or the years they'd spent in the penthouse building, something that turned out to have been mostly her building while he watched. She was fine. He was the one who was shattered, and he was standing on her harbor looking at her life, and he had absolutely no idea what he was entitled to. He went back to Min's apartment that evening. She opened the door before he knocked. She'd probably seen him coming up the street. "I'm staying," he said. Min looked at him. I'm not going to force anything. I'm not going to tell her who I am. He stopped, started again. "I need to be near her. I need to see that she's..." He couldn't finish that sentence into something that made sense, so he stopped trying. "I'll stay in the village. I'll find something useful to do. I won't approach her without your knowledge." Min studied him for a long moment. The social worker's assessment behind her eyes, calculating risk, calculating the shape of this man, whether the stated intention matched the visible person. "There's a house at the bottom of the North Path that belongs to the Yoon family," she said finally. "They rent rooms to seasonal workers. I can make a call." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." She crossed her arms. "The first sign that you're destabilizing her, one sign, any form, I will make it impossible for you to stay in this village. I have relationships here that you don't, and I will use them." "I understand." "I doubt it," said, not unkindly, "but we'll see." He moved into the Yoon house the next morning. It was a single room with a narrow bed and a window that looked down the hill toward the harbor. The floor had a slight tilt to it, corrected long ago by someone wedging something under one of the support beams, the fix more honest than perfect. He put his bag under the bed and sat on the mattress and looked at the window. He called Dasik and told him to go back to Seoul. Dasik said, "Sir, the organization needs you there. Byung-kwan's probationary arrangement needs oversight. The Haedong situation needs to be monitored. And you." "I don't need oversight." "That's not what I meant." Dojin looked at the window, at the slice of harbor visible below. "I'll check in. The work doesn't stop. I'll handle what needs handling remotely. Hyun can be my presence in the city." A long pause. "How long?" He didn't know. He said, "Go back, Dasik. and ended the call. The next day he fixed a fence. It belonged to the Yoon family, and it had been broken at the bottom corner for what looked like several seasons, and Mrs. Yoon mentioned it in passing when he paid for the first week, not as a request, just as the kind of thing people mention about their own homes when they've gotten used to it. He went out in the morning with tools he found in the shed and fixed it. He did it badly at first. His hands knew how to handle firearms and how to apply precise pressure to specific human situations and how to move through a room in ways that controlled the dynamics of it, but they did not reliably know how to handle a fence post in clay soil. He figured it out by the third attempt. The fence held. Mrs. Yoon saw it when she came out to hang laundry. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at him without saying anything, which was a kind of acceptance. He started working at the harbor the day after. Not fishing, they didn't need another fisherman, but the net maintenance work, which was constant and unglamorous and required 2 or 3 extra sets of hands most days that the village didn't reliably have. He learned by watching, and then by doing badly, and then by doing less badly. His hands developed new blisters in different places than the old ones. He didn't think about what this meant. He saw her on the third day from a distance. She was at the market, talking to the woman who ran the vegetable stall, and she had the same canvas bag with the books. He was on the other side of the road. She didn't look at him. He went around the long way. On the 5th day, he was mending a section of net at the harbor end, crouched over the work in the cold morning, and he heard footsteps on the dock behind him, and then a voice said, "You're doing that wrong." He went very still. Then he turned around. She was standing 6 feet away, in the green jacket, with a cup of something hot that she was holding in both hands, looking at the section of net he'd been working on with the specific expression of someone whose patience with preventable errors was limited. His entire chest compressed. She looked at him, not with recognition, not with anything except the mild attention of someone evaluating a stranger's competence, and said, "The knot sequence. You're going left when you should go right at the 3rd pass. The whole section will loosen in a week." He looked down at the net, then up at her. "Show me," he said. His voice came out level. He had no idea how. She handed him her cup, just handed it to him without ceremony, the way you hand a cup to someone so your hands are free, and crouched beside the net and redid the knot sequence, talking him through it in a matter-of-fact way that suggested she'd explained this kind of thing before and didn't find teaching tedious. Her hands were quick and certain. She'd learned this here, he understood. Some fisherman's wife had taught her, or she'd watched and figured it out, the same way she figured everything out. He held her cup with both hands and watched her hands and breathed. "Where are you from?" she asked, not looking up from the net. "Seoul," he said. She glanced up briefly. "Long way." "Yes." She went back to the knot. "What are you doing here?" He looked at the harbor, at the boats, at the water beyond them. He said, "I needed to be somewhere different." She accepted this without comment, the way people accept things in small places where everyone's reasons for being somewhere are their own business. She finished the section, stood, held out her hand for her cup. He gave it back to her. She looked at him for a moment, the same evaluative look, nothing personal in it, just the clear-eyed assessment she apparently applied to everything, and said, "The harbor crew could use another pair of hands if you're staying a while. Talk to Mr. Yoon." "I'm staying with the Yoons," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Then you've already met him." She turned to go. "Fix the rest of the section the right way. It matters more than you think." She walked back up the dock. Dojin stood there holding nothing, the cold coming off the water, and understood that he had just had the first conversation with his wife in almost 4 months, and she had corrected his knot work and told him to talk to his landlord, and he was going to have to be very, very careful. He was 3 weeks into the village when the trouble arrived from Seoul. He'd known it was coming in some form. You couldn't hollow out your physical presence from an organization like the Baiko Syndicate without creating pressure somewhere. He'd managed it remotely, through Daesik and Hyun, handling calls in the early mornings before the harbor work started and late at night in the tilted room with the lights off. It had worked adequately. Byung-kwan was compliant. The Haedong situation had gone quiet. What he hadn't anticipated was Avery Morgan. She called him directly, not through intermediaries, not through his legal team, on a Tuesday morning when he was on the harbor and had to step away from the nets to take it. He walked to the far end of the dock. "I heard you found her," Avery said. Her voice had the quality of someone who'd rehearsed the opening line and was nervous about what came after. Where did you hear that? Soul talks, Dojin. You know that. A pause. Is she... She's alive. He heard something release on the other end of the call. Genuine relief, he thought. And he didn't know what to do with that. Avery Morgan was not someone he'd spent time trying to read. I need to tell you something, Avery said. Something I should have told you before now. He waited. The night of the fire. She stopped, started again. There were reports. After, when the investigation was happening. Some people at the hotel, staff, they talked about what they saw, about the sequence of events. Another pause, and he could hear her deciding, the specific texture of someone choosing to cross a line they've been standing at for a while. There's a story going around in certain circles about why you went for me instead of looking for Zuri first. The story is not... She paused again. The story is not kind to you, or to your marriage. I know the story, he said flatly. He'd known the story since week 3, the version circulating in Seoul's social and business networks, where the fire became the event that revealed what Dojin had always truly valued, where Avery was the priority because she was the priority, where Zuri's disappearance was either tragic convenience or pointed indicator. He'd chosen not to engage with it because engaging with it required energy he didn't have, and because the truth of what had happened was too complicated to fit in the shape of a rebuttal. There's more to it now, Avery said. Byung-Kwan's been talking. He went very still on the end of the dock. The water moved below him. A bird called somewhere behind him. What has he been saying? That the marriage was... that Zuri was a social arrangement. That the real relationship was always... She stopped. With me. That the fire was... that you knew she was still inside when you came for me. The cold coming off the water was significant. He felt it clearly. He's been saying this to whom? To everyone who will listen. Business contacts, the Haedong crew, and apparently to at least 2 journalists who cover organized crime-adjacent stories. One of them has been asking questions at the Imperium Seoul, talking to former staff. A pause. Dojin, if this story gets traction, if it gets published in any form, it won't just damage you. It will define what happened to Zuri. It will turn her disappearance into a narrative that she'll have to live inside when her memory comes back. If... Avery stopped herself. It will follow her. He understood precisely what Avery was describing. A story, once it achieved sufficient circulation, became a kind of infrastructure. It shaped what people expected to find when they looked, and it shaped what they were willing to believe when they found something different. If the story of Dojin's marriage as social arrangement and his choice at the fire as intentional abandonment became the established version, then Zuri's return, whenever it happened, whatever form it took, would happen inside that story's gravity. He had been thinking of Byung-Kwan as a managed problem. He had been wrong. How long has he been talking? Dojin said. At least 2 weeks. Maybe longer. I only heard last night. She paused. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. I had to verify before I... Can you get me the journalist's name? I already have it. She read it. He memorized it. What are you going to do? He looked down at the water. Below the dock, through the dark water, he could see the harbor bottom, rocks and sand, clear in the cold. He had been here 3 weeks. He had fixed a fence and mended nets and had one conversation about knot work and several more after that, incremental and small, the slow construction of something that had no name yet. He had watched her with the children at the net house through the open door one afternoon, the way she handled the difficult ones, the ones who didn't want to sit still, with the same matter-of-fact patience she'd applied to his knot work, as if the assumption of their capability was simply the starting point. He had watched that and stood outside the door in the cold and known that this specific thing he was watching was what the letters in her files had been made of. He had been telling himself he had time, that the village was a kind of suspension, real life waiting in Seoul while something necessary happened here. Byung-Kwan had just ended the suspension. If he stayed in Haedong, the story would spread and calcify. The journalist would publish. Whatever version of the truth eventually reached Zuri would arrive already framed, already shaped by a man who'd been running his own quiet coup for months and had correctly identified that Dojin's absence from Seoul was the best cover he'd ever have. If he went back to Seoul, he left her. He left her in the village with no knowledge of who she was or who he was, and he went back to fight a war inside an organization she had spent 6 years quietly building while he took credit for the architecture, and he did it alone, without her, because she didn't know she was his partner. He pressed his palm flat against the dock railing. The wood was cold and rough and very solid. He said, "I need you to go on record, Avery, publicly. Whatever you saw that night, whatever the truth of what happened in the fire, I need you to say it clearly, with your name on it." A long silence. He could hear her breathing. "That's not a small thing to ask," she said. "I know. My business relationships, I know what it costs." He said it without apology, because apology was not what was needed. "I'm asking anyway." Another silence. Longer. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you need." He ended the call. He stood on the dock. Below him the water was very cold and very clear. He turned around and looked back up the harbor road. At the net house at the end of it, where through the open door he could hear, distantly, a child reading aloud, slowly, sounding out something difficult, and then getting it, and then the sound of her voice saying, "Yes, exactly, keep going." And the child reading on, faster now, gaining confidence from those 3 words the way children do when the right person says them at the right moment. He had to go back to Seoul. He had to go back, and he had to tear down the story Byung-kwan was building before it became load-bearing. And he had to do it in a way that left space for whatever happened next, for whatever version of the truth Zuri eventually found her way back to. Because if he let Byung-kwan's narrative become the foundation she returned to, then nothing else he did would matter. But before he did that, before he made the call to Dasik and started the sequence of things that couldn't be undone, he went back to the harbor end and picked up the net he'd been working on and finished the section the way she'd taught him, the knots going right at the 3rd pass, the sequence correct, the work that would hold. He did it until it was done. Then he walked up this hill to the Yoon house and picked up his phone and started making the calls that were going to cost him everything he had left, because the man who had stood outside a burning building holding a wedding ring had finally understood what the inscription meant. Not sentiment, not decoration, but the specific structural truth that some things only hold if you build them right, and you only build them right if you're willing to learn how from the person who knows. He made 4 calls from the Yoon house before sunrise. The first was to Dasik, who picked up on the second ring because Dasik never fully slept when things were in motion, and Dojin said, "I'm coming back, tonight. Have Hyun pull everything we have on Byung-kwan's external contacts for the last 6 weeks. Every name, every location, every transaction that moved through his division. I want it on the table when I arrive." Dasik said, "How long have you known?" "Long enough. Move." The second call was to his legal team, specifically to a lawyer named Shin, who handled the syndicate's legitimate business structures, and who had the specific quality of being absolutely unsentimental about things that needed to be done. Dojin told him to prepare a full documentation package on the Byung-kwan situation, framed for both internal disciplinary use and, if necessary, external legal exposure. Shin asked no questions. He said he'd have a draft framework by morning. The third call was to a journalist named Park Soo-yeon, who covered financial crime and institutional corruption for a mid-tier Seoul publication that had more credibility than circulation. He had never spoken to her directly. He had her number because Dasik maintained a contact file on every journalist in Seoul who touched organized crime-adjacent stories, and the file on Park Soo-yeon described her as rigorous, difficult, and not for sale. He told her he wanted to give her something. She said she'd call him back in 10 minutes to verify the number was real. She called back in 8. "I'll tell you everything that happened the night of the Imperium fire," he said. "Everything. My account, documentation, a witness. In exchange, I want nothing except accuracy." Park Soo-yeon was quiet for a moment. "You understand I'm not going to write what you want. I'm going to write what I find." "I know." "Why are you calling me instead of your PR people?" "Because my PR people would make it clean, and I don't need it clean. I need it true." Another pause. "Avery Morgan. We'll go on record." "Yes." He heard the specific sound of a person deciding something. "When?" 2 days. Seoul. I'll send you an address." The fourth call was the one he'd been putting last because it required something different from the others. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the gray pre-dawn of the Yoon house and looked at the harbor visible through the window. The boats, the water catching the first thin light, and he dialed Min Jong-hee. She answered on the fourth ring, sleep still in her voice, which meant he'd woken her and he didn't care. "I have to go back to Seoul," he said. "There's a situation that I can't manage from here. It directly affects her. What she'll come back to, what the story will be when she remembers. I need you to understand what I'm doing and why." Silence on the line. He could hear Min processing. "How long?" she said. "I don't know. A week, maybe 2. The meeting with Dae-sik happened in the private office of a restaurant Dojin owned through 2 layers of legal separation, a place he'd chosen years ago for exactly this kind of meeting, because it had no windows and 3 exits, and the owner, a man named Choi, who was unrelated to Byung-kwan and loyal in the way that certain people become loyal through sustained fair treatment, would not remember anything he wasn't asked to remember. The documentation Dae-sik had pulled was spread across the table. Financial records, communication logs, a timeline of Byung-kwan's movements over the past 6 weeks built from a combination of surveillance and informant reports. Dojin sat in front of it and went through it methodically while Dae-sik stood near the wall and Hyun sat in the corner with a second set of copies. It was worse than he'd calculated from the coast. Byung-kwan hadn't just been talking to the Haedong crew and journalists. He'd been repositioning assets, slowly, in increments small enough to look like operational decisions within his authority, but consistently in a direction that moved value laterally out of the syndicate's central structures and toward adjacent operations that Byung-kwan had personal relationships with. Nothing provably criminal within the organization's own internal definitions. Nothing that crossed a single clear line. Just dozens of small moves, each individually defensible, that in aggregate amounted to a man quietly building an exit with the organization's own materials. "He's been planning this for longer than the fire," Dojin said. "At least 8 months, Dae-sik said. "Possibly a year. The fire just accelerated his timeline." He saw an opportunity. He saw a man who was absent and decided absent meant finished. Dae-sik's voice was flat. "He wasn't wrong about the math. He was wrong about you," Hyun said from the corner. "There's something else." Dojin looked at him. Hyun was 37, had been with the syndicate since he was 22, and had the particular quality of someone who had learned to speak carefully because he had once spoken carelessly and it had cost him significantly. He unfolded a piece of paper from his jacket pocket and set it on the table. Byung-kwan met with someone outside the Haedong crew 3 days ago, private room in a hotel in Itaewon. He paused. The man he met is a public prosecutor named Lee Gi-soo, Financial Crimes Division. The room was very still. "He's building insurance," Dae-sik said. It wasn't a question. "He's offering something to Lee Gi-soo that makes an organized crime prosecution worth his while," Hyun said. "We don't know what specifically, but Byung-kwan has access to 18 years of operational history. He was present for decisions that—" He stopped. Dojin said, "How much time do we have?" "Unknown. If Lee Gi-soo moves fast, it could be days. If he's being cautious, weeks." Dojin looked at the financial records on the table, at the timeline, at the photograph from the Itaewon hotel that Hyun had placed at the edge of the documentation, a surveillance image, slightly grainy, Byung-kwan's profile visible through a lobby window. 19 years. The man had been in the room for 19 years' worth of decisions. "Find him," Dojin said. "Not through intermediaries. I want to speak to him directly." He picked up his jacket. "Set the meeting for tonight." Dae-sik said, "He won't come if you ask directly. He'll know what it means." "Then don't ask. Tell him I have the evidence of the asset repositioning, and I'm offering him one conversation before I use it." He put on his jacket. "He'll come." He was right. Byung-kwan came. The location Dojin chose was not the private club in Gangnam. That place had been for a conversation that still had a diplomatic register. The location he chose was a warehouse space in Guro that the syndicate used for storage, empty at this hour, lit by work lights that cast hard shadows and left the ceiling in darkness. It was a room that communicated very precisely what kind of conversation this was going to be. Byung-kwan arrived with 3 men instead of 2. He stopped inside the door when he saw the space, and something moved through his face, calculation, and behind the calculation, the first real edge of fear. Dojin was sitting on a crate in the center of the room. He had Dae-sik and Hyun with him, and no one else, which was a deliberate imbalance in Byung-kwan's favor that communicated confidence in a way that 3 additional bodies never could. He was not armed, visibly. He was wearing the same jacket he'd driven from Haydam in, which still smelled faintly of the harbor. "Sit down," Dojin said. "I'll stand. Suit yourself." Dojin looked at him. He had not seen Byung-kwan in person since the Gangnam Club, which felt like a different geological era. "You talked to a prosecutor." Byung-kwan's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you—" Lee Gi-soo. Financial crimes. Hotel Itaewon, 3 days ago. Private room booked under a name you rotate every 6 months. Dojin tilted his head. The name this time was Han Jae-won. We've been watching that alias for 2 months. The blood left Byung-kwan's face with the specific speed of a man whose fallback position has just been removed. "Whatever you told him," Dojin said, "he doesn't have it yet in a form he can use. You haven't handed him documentation. You've been dangling, building your leverage with him the same way you've been building it with Haidong. Little pieces, enough to maintain interest, not enough to commit until you're certain of your exit." He paused. "You're not certain yet. That's why you're here." Byung-kwan said nothing. "The asset repositioning I can document internally," Dojin said. "The communication logs with Haedong I have on record. The conversation with Lee Gi-soo I can make available to certain people who have an interest in which prosecutors are conducting which conversations." He said this quietly, without theatrical weight. "You have leveraged yourself in 3 different directions simultaneously, and you have not yet secured any of them. That's a dangerous position." Byung-kwan's face was doing something complex. The mathematics of a man who had been outmaneuvered and was trying to find the one line of the calculation he might still have. "The story," he said, "about your wife, about the fire. What about it? It's already out. You can't—" He stopped, recalibrated. "It's in 3 different circles. Even if you shut me down completely, it keeps moving." "I know." Dojin stood up from the crate. He was the same height as Byung-kwan and had 20 years less physical weathering on him, and the work lights from above cast his face in a way that did nothing to soften it. "Which is why I'm not relying on shutting you down to stop it. I'm going on record myself. Avery Morgan is going on record. A journalist named Park Soo-yeon is going to write the accurate version of events, with documentation, and it's going to be published before whatever you've been feeding anyone else has time to calcify." Something in Byung-kwan's expression shifted, genuine surprise, which was rare enough on that face to be notable. "You're going public," he said. I'm going accurate. There's a difference. It'll expose the organization. It'll expose a night at a hotel fire and the sequence of events that followed. Avery Morgan's version, the hotel supervisor's testimony, and mine. The organization's name won't appear." He looked at Byung-kwan steadily. "But yours will. Your name will appear as the source of a competing narrative that contradicts documented evidence. And Lee Gi-soo will have a file on his desk within 48 hours documenting the asset repositioning and the unauthorized external contacts, filed not by me, but by the organization's internal compliance structure, which makes it a legitimate business dispute, not an organized crime matter." He watched Byung-kwan absorb this. "You'll be radioactive," Dojin said, "to Haedong, to Lee Gi-soo, to anyone else you've been courting. Nobody moves on a man who's been publicly named as a liar in a documented controversy and simultaneously filed against in a business dispute. Too much exposure, too much noise." He paused. "You'll have nothing." Byung-kwan was breathing harder now, though he was working to control it. His hands at his sides were not fully relaxed. "What do you want?" he said, the voice of a man who had run the calculation and found it empty. "I want you to call every journalist contact you've spoken to and tell them you have no further information. I want you to end this Haedong conversation permanently, and I want you to walk out of this organization in the next 72 hours, formally, with a separation that our legal team will prepare." Dojin's voice was completely even. "You'll have a settlement, modest, enough to start something else somewhere else. In exchange for all of that, the compliance filing goes in a drawer." A long silence. One of Byung-kwan's men shifted his weight near the wall, and Dasik looked at him once, and the man went still again. "And if I don't," Byung-kwan said, "then I use everything I have, which is more than you have, and I use it all at once, and you deal with the consequences of that without a settlement and without the goodwill of anyone who might otherwise have helped you." He didn't say it as a threat. He said it as information. I'd rather you take the first option. 19 years is real. I'm not pretending it isn't. Byung-kwan looked at him for a long time. Whatever he was looking for in Dojin's face, a crack, a hesitation, some evidence that this was performance rather than position, he didn't find it. 72 hours, Byung-kwan said. 72 hours. He left with his 3 men. The warehouse door closed. The work lights hummed. Dasik let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for the better part of 10 minutes. He'll comply, Hyun said. He'll comply until he thinks of something better, Dojin said. Monitor him for the full 72. If anything moves, any call, any meeting, tell me immediately. He picked up his phone. I need to call Park Soo-yeon. The interview with Park Soo-yeon happened the next day in the office of Dojin's legal team, which was neutral enough to be professional and formal enough to keep the conversation anchored. Avery Morgan was there in person, which had required her flying in from a business trip to Busan, which she did without complaint and without additional requests. He noticed this. He filed it in the category of things he owed people. Park Soo-yeon arrived with a recorder and a notebook and the specific posture of a journalist who had decided to treat the whole situation as a story rather than an event, which was, Dojin recognized, both what he'd asked for and also slightly unnerving in practice. She asked Avery first. She asked her everything, the night of the fire, the sequence, what she saw, what she knew, what she had assumed. Avery answered every question directly, without deflecting, without the media-trained vagueness that people in her position typically deployed. She described being trapped, described seeing Dojin, described the timeline of the rescue as she'd experienced it. She described hearing later about Zuri's disappearance and what she had known and when. Then Park Soo-yeon turned to Dojin. Tell me what you believed in that moment, she said. Not what you know now. What you believed when you made the decision. He told her. He told her about Hyun's voice in the earpiece. She's out, she was moving toward the courtyard. And about the calculation he'd made on the basis of that. And about what he'd found when he got outside. He told her about the ring. He told her about 11 weeks in the police reclassification and what the hotel supervisor Oh Gyung-soo had told him. He told her about the second shuttle and the cross-reference error and Chungmu Medical Center. He did not tell her where Zuri was now. That was the one thing he had decided before he sat down in the room, that Zuri's current location, her current life, her current self, was not part of the story that was being told today. Today's story was about the fire and the sequence and the truth of it. The rest was not for publication. Park Soo-yeon looked at him when he finished. She had been writing the whole time, not recording, writing in longhand in the notebook, which was unusual enough that he'd noticed it at the start and filed it as a tell about how she worked. You know, this story doesn't make you look good, she said. I know. Even told accurately, even with Avery Morgan confirming the sequence, you still made a decision that cost my wife everything she had, he said. Yes, I know. And you're willing to put that in print. I'm willing to have the truth in print. What it makes me look like is secondary. Park Soo-yeon looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote something else in the notebook. One more question. Go ahead. The competing narrative, the one currently circulating. You know where it originated. Yes. Are you willing to say that on record? He thought about Byung-kwan and the 72 hours and the settlement that was contingent on compliance. He thought about the 18 years of operational history that Byung-kwan was carrying and the prosecutor Lee Gi-soo and the very thin set of threads he was currently managing to keep from becoming a legal catastrophe. No, he said, that part I'll handle internally. Park Soo-yeon nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected. The article will run Friday. I'll send you a courtesy notification before it publishes. Not a draft, not for approval, just notification. That's more than fair. She left. Dojin sat in the chair where he'd been sitting for 2 hours and felt the particular physical exhaustion of sustained performance under pressure. Not performance in the dishonest sense, but the effort of being precise and controlled when the easier thing would have been to break in any of several directions. Avery sat across from him. She hadn't left yet. Are you all right? She said. No, he said. It was the most honest word he'd said in the meeting. She absorbed this. She said, Will she be? He looked at his hand, the ring on his finger, the inscription facing inward. I don't know, he said. I'm trying to build something for her to come back to that doesn't have the wrong shape. Avery nodded slowly. She picked up her bag, stood, then paused. The night of the fire, she said. When you were moving the beam, you were talking. Not to me, sort of to yourself. You said her name, twice. She paused. I don't think you knew you were doing it. He didn't respond. She left. The article ran on Friday. Park Soo-yeon had done what she'd said she would do, written what she found, without editorializing in either direction, which meant it was not a redemption narrative and it was not a condemnation. It was a sequence of events with named sources and documented evidence and the specific credibility of a story that did not try to make anyone into a simple thing. It got picked up by 2 larger publications within 24 hours. By Saturday, it was the dominant version of events in the circles where the competing narrative had been circulating. Byung-kwan's journalists went quiet. Their stories, whatever shape they'd been taking, lost the oxygen they needed when the documented version filled the space first. Byung-kwan's compliance was confirmed at hour 68 of the 72 when his signed separation paperwork arrived at the legal team's office. The compliance filing went into a drawer as agreed. Hyun continued monitoring for another week and found nothing worth reporting. The thing was done. The Haedong crew sent a contact to Day-6's phone. Not an approach, just a signal, the underworld equivalent of a cleared throat, indicating they understood the situation had resolved and they had no further interest in the Western Territory question. Day-6 told Dojin. Dojin said good and went back to the other problem. The other problem was what came next. He had handled Seoul. He had protected the story, neutralized the threat, taken the organization through a transition that left it functional without Byung-kwan and somewhat more honestly structured than it had been before, because the process of documenting everything for the legal team had required confronting several things that had been operating on assumption rather than design. He had done all of this in 11 days. He had thought about Haedom every one of those 11 days. On the 12th day, he drove back. He arrived in the late afternoon, parked the car on the main road, and walked up to the harbor. The nets were out. Someone had done maintenance on the section he'd been working on before he left, which meant Mr. Yoon had organized coverage, which meant life had continued without him in exactly the way life always continued without any specific person. He went to the Yoon house and knocked. Mrs. Yoon opened the door and looked at him without particular surprise, which suggested Min had told her he would be back, which was more consideration than he'd expected. His room was still his room. His bag was still under the bed. He sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the window and the harbor below it and felt the city of Seoul fall off him, the way things fall off in water. Not all at once, but progressively, the weight of it releasing in stages. He went to the harbor the next morning. He had been back at the nets for 40 minutes, working the section that needed attention at the far end of the dock, when he heard footsteps that he recognized now. Their particular rhythm, the cadence of someone who moved with purpose and without hurry. You came back, she said. He looked up at her. She was standing 6 feet away, same green jacket, no canvas bag today, just her hands in her pockets and her eyes on him with that clear-eyed, direct quality that he had apparently been in love with for 6 years without fully registering what it was he was in love with. I said I would, he said. She looked at the network. Seoul? Yes. Finished? He considered this. For now. She pulled her hands out of her pockets and crouched beside the net, checking the section he'd been working on. She examined the knots, the ones he'd done today and the ones he'd done before he left, the ones he'd taught himself to do correctly. She ran her fingers along the sequence. She looked up at him. Something in her expression had changed in the 11 days, or maybe it hadn't changed and he was only now calibrated to read it. A quality of consideration, of paying attention. You did the whole section right, she said. You showed me how. She stood. She was looking at him in a way that was slightly different from the evaluative look. Not reading his competence now, reading something else. Something she seemed slightly uncertain how to name. I don't know your name, she said. He had been waiting for this. He had known it was coming. This specific moment, this specific ordinary fact of 2 people who had been gradually becoming something to each other in the language of small shared tasks, arriving at the place where names were relevant. Dojin, he said. She turned it over, testing the sound of it. Korean. Yes, I'm. She paused. The pause was not long, but it had a particular quality to it. The pause of someone who was used to this moment, used to the minor discontinuity of introducing herself with a name that felt partly adopted. Zuri, she said. That's what I go by here. He knew why she'd said it that way. That's what I go by here, because Min would have been honest with her about the general shape of her situation, that her name was uncertain, that Zuri was what had persisted through the amnesia, what she'd been called when she came in, and what had stuck. She wore it with the slightly provisional quality of someone who had made peace with a thing while knowing it might not be the whole truth. He said, "It's a good name." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, in a register he hadn't heard from her before, quieter, slightly less organized, "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for something? Not anxiously, just like there's something ahead that you haven't gotten to yet." He held very still. "I feel that lately," she said. "It's not unpleasant, just..." She looked at the water. Present. He looked at the water too. He said, "Yes, I feel that." They stood there for a moment, side by side on the dock, looking at the harbor and the cold light on the water. He could feel his own heartbeat very clearly. He breathed carefully. Then she said, "The children's program needs someone to help build 2 new bookshelves. The net house doesn't have storage, and we keep stacking books on the floor. I was going to ask Mr. Yoon, but he has a bad back." She glanced sideways at him. "Do you know how to build a bookshelf?" He thought of the fence, of everything he'd learned to do by doing it badly first. "I can figure it out," he said. "Good." She straightened up, the decision made in her particular way. Clean, no performance. "Tomorrow, after the morning session, I'll get the materials." She walked back up the dock. He watched her go until she reached the end and turned up the harbor road and disappeared from his sight line. And then he stood there alone on the dock with the nets and the cold water and the specific feeling of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been handed, without ceremony, the beginning of a reason to set it down. He did not know how long it would take. He did not know when the memories would begin to surface, or in what order, or what shape they would have when they arrived. He did not know what she would do with the truth when she had it, whether the woman she'd become in Haydom would find any recognizable connection to the woman who'd written 7-page assessments and untraceable letters and had gone back into a burning corridor for a stranger without hesitating. He did not know if she would be able to forgive him. I was not sure, honestly, with everything he'd read in her files and everything Oh Gyung-soo had told him and everything he'd understood slowly and painfully about the architecture of their years together, that forgiveness was even the right frame for what needed to happen between them. Forgiveness implied a scale. What they needed might be something more like reconstruction, done carefully, done honestly, done by 2 people who were going to have to be very honest with each other about very difficult things. But she had told him tomorrow. She had said she'd get the materials. He picked up the net and went back to work. In Seoul, Park Soo-yeon's article was being read in offices and restaurants and on phones on the subway. And Byung-kwan was somewhere in the city beginning whatever came next for him. And Daesik was managing 17 things simultaneously the way Daesik always had. And the Baeko syndicate was running, imperfectly, humanly, with the seams showing in places they'd never shown before, which was not entirely a bad thing. And in a net house at the end of Haydom Village Harbor, children were reading aloud, sounding out difficult words, being told by a woman with a clear voice and a specific kind of patience that could not be entirely learned, only partly innate, partly built. Yes, exactly. Keep going. He heard it from the dock. He always heard it from the dock. He worked the nets until the light started to go. And then he walked up the harbor road past the net house where the last of the afternoon session was finishing, and through the open door he saw her crouched beside a small girl who was pointing at something in a book with one finger, her expression fierce with the effort of working something out, and he saw the moment the girl got it, saw it in her face before he heard it in her voice. And he saw Zuri's expression when she saw it too, the specific unguarded thing that moved through her face at someone else's small victory. He did not stop walking. He did not slow down. He did not let himself stand in the doorway this time. He walked past and up the hill to the Yoon house and sat on the edge of his bed in the tilted room and took the ring off his finger and held it in his palm and looked at the inscription. Always beside you. He had thought, when he'd first put it on his finger 3 months ago in the penthouse, that wearing it was a form of faithfulness. He understood now that faithfulness was not a static thing, not a ring on a finger, not a declaration made once and maintained by inertia. It was something you had to choose to do, specifically and actively, every day, in the full knowledge of your own capacity for failure. He had failed significantly. He was going to keep going anyway. Tomorrow, there were bookshelves to build, and he had never built a bookshelf in his life. And he would figure it out by doing it badly first and then correctly, and she would probably correct him at least once along the way, and that would be its own kind of beginning. He put the ring back on his finger. Outside the window, the last light was going off the harbor, and the fishing boats rocked gently in the dark, and somewhere below a door opened and closed and footsteps went up a path, and the village settled into its nighttime quiet, with the particular completeness of a place that had been doing this for a very long time, and would go on doing it long after everyone currently in it was gone. He lay down on the narrow bed without taking off his shoes, and looked at the ceiling and waited for tomorrow with the patience of a man who had finally understood that patience was not passivity. It was the hardest kind of work there was, and he was only just learning how to do it, and the learning was going to take everything he had, and he was not going to stop. The bookshelves took 3 days. Not because they were complicated, the design was simple, 2 units, pine boards, adjustable shelving, but because Dojin had never built a bookshelf in his life, and the first attempt produced something that was visually plausible but structurally dishonest, the kind of thing that would hold books for 6 months and then fail at the worst possible moment. He dismantled it on the second afternoon and started again, this time asking Mr. Yoon's eldest son for 40 minutes of instruction that he had to actively suppress his instinct to abbreviate. Zuri came by on the second day to check progress. She looked at what he'd done, looked at him, said nothing for a moment, and then picked up a board and showed him the proper angle for the dado joint without asking whether he wanted the help. He watched her hands. She had calluses now that she probably hadn't had before. On the inner fingers, from the fishing nets she'd learned to mend, from the harbor work she'd absorbed into her life here, the same way she absorbed everything, with a matter-of-fact competence that made it look as though the skill had always been waiting in her. He did not know if she'd had those calluses before the fire. He had not looked at his wife's hands carefully enough to know that. On the third day, he finished the shelves, and they were solid. Not perfect. The grain didn't match across the units, and one edge was slightly proud, but solid in the way that mattered, weight-bearing and honest. He carried them to the net house in 2 trips, and Zuri and 2 of the reading program mothers organized the books onto them while he held each unit against the wall for leveling. When they were done, one of the mothers, a woman named Yoonji, who had been in the village her whole life and had the locals' particular tolerance for outsiders who proved useful, brought out a thermos of barley tea, and they all stood around and looked at the shelves with the books on them. It was a small moment. It mattered in the way small moments matter, disproportionately, immediately, without apology. Zuri was standing beside him. She was looking at the shelves. She said quietly, not particularly directed at anyone, "This is what a room needs. Something that says people are going to stay." He held his cup and said nothing. She looked at him sideways. "Thank you for doing it right." "You told me it mattered more than I thought," he said. "I believed you." Something moved through her expression, brief, unclassifiable, the specific kind of reaction that people have when something lands in a place they didn't know was open. She looked back at the shelves. "I say that a lot, apparently," she said. "Min tells me I've always said things like that. Even when I first arrived and couldn't tell you my own name, I apparently had opinions about how things should be done." She paused. "She says I corrected one of the nurses about the medication schedule on my 3rd day. Was she wrong about the medication schedule?" "Yes," Zuri said without hesitation. Then a beat later, "Mine also says she was grateful I caught it." He almost smiled. The almost was enough. That was the morning of the day everything changed. He was back at the harbor by midday, doing the routine maintenance work that had become his unofficial role, the kind of work that nobody particularly owned and that needed doing consistently, and which he had discovered suited him in a way that he would have found impossible to explain to anyone who knew him in soul. There was something in the specificity of it, in the fact that a net that was properly maintained did the thing a net was supposed to do, and a net that wasn't, didn't. That was almost medicinal in its clarity after years of managing systems where cause and effect were always obscured by layers of human complexity and competing interest. He was 40 minutes into the afternoon work when Min Jong-hee came down the harbor road. He saw her from a distance. Her walk was purposeful in a different way than usual. The walk of someone carrying something that they haven't decided how to put down. He set the nets aside and stood up before she reached him. "Something happened," he said. "This morning," she said. She stopped in front of him. "After you all finished with the shelves. She came to see me." He waited. "She's been having fragments for about 2 weeks, maybe longer. She didn't tell me immediately because she said she wasn't sure if they were memories or things she'd invented. You know how it is with that type of injury. The brain fills gaps sometimes with constructed material that feels equally real. She was being careful." "What kind of fragments?" "A city. A skyline at night, very high up. She thinks from a high floor, a specific smell she can't source. A voice," she said. "A man's voice, saying something she can't quite hear but that feels—" Min paused, choosing the word. "Important." She said the voice feels important. Dojin's hand was very still at his side. "This morning after the shelf work," Min said, "she came and sat at my table and said she'd felt something. When she was standing next to you looking at the shelves." She looked at him directly. "She said it wasn't a memory exactly. She said it was a feeling of recognition, like something she'd felt before in a specific situation, being next to someone in a room after something had been built." He looked at the harbor, at the boats. "She doesn't know it's you," Min said. "She doesn't have your name, your face, any of the specific content, but something in her is—" She stopped. "Moving." The neurologist we consulted when she first arrived said it was possible that emotional resonance could precede explicit memory recovery, that the emotional circuitry sometimes reconnects before the narrative circuitry. She paused. "I think that's what's happening." He turned back to look at Min. "How long?" "I don't know. Days, weeks. There's no reliable timeline, but Dojin—" She used his name directly, which she hadn't done before. "It could come back fast when it starts. All at once. Or in a rush that feels like all at once. And she needs to be with someone who can hold that. Who knows the full shape of what she's going to recover." She looked at him carefully. "She asked me today if I knew anything about the man from Seoul who was working the harbor." He breathed. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were someone who came here to figure some things out." Min's eyes were steady. "I told her I thought you were a person who had made serious mistakes and was trying to understand them. I told her that was my general impression from knowing you, and that she should use her own judgment." He looked at her. That was honest. "I don't have another setting," she said, "and neither should you. Not now. Not with her." She put her hands in her jacket pockets. "You need to tell her who you are. Not all of it at once. Not the syndicate, not the full architecture of your life, but who you are to her. Before the memories come back on their own, and she realizes you knew and said nothing." He had known this was coming. He had known it since the dock, since she'd told him her name with that slight provisionality, since she'd said, "That's what I go by here," and he'd heard the door in that sentence, the space for something else. He had known, and he had also been afraid, which was not a feeling he had much practice navigating, and he had been doing what people do with unfamiliar fear, managing around it, keeping busy, building things. "Tonight," he said. Mine nodded. She looked at him for another moment, the full weight of the social worker's assessment in it, and then she walked back up the harbor road and left him with the nets and the water and the specific knowledge that today was the day the provisional period ended. He did not go to her immediately. He finished the afternoon's work because unfinished work was its own kind of problem, and because he needed the hours, and because he had learned in Hatem that the hands being occupied was not avoidance but a form of preparation. He worked until the light began going, and then he put the nets away and washed his hands in the cold water barrel at the dock end and stood there for a moment looking at nothing in particular. Then he walked up to the western path. He knocked on her door at the third house from the top. She opened it after a moment, still in the green jacket, which meant she'd been out recently or was planning to go. She looked at him with the usual direct quality and then with something additional, something that had been building in the look over the weeks, a layer of attention that was different from the evaluative. "Dojin," she said. "Can I come in?" he said. She stepped back. The inside of the house was small and organized in a way that was completely her, things grouped by relationship, not by category. books next to a piece of fishing rope next to a drawing. One of the children had given her next to a small stone she'd picked up somewhere on the coastal path. He recognized the organizational logic without understanding yet how he recognized it, the same way you recognize a piece of music you haven't heard in years, not consciously stored but somehow still there. She had put the kettle on before he could say anything, which was hospitality as reflex, and they both sat at her small table, and she looked at him across it. "Min came to see me today," she said. Not a question. "I know, she came to me first." "She told you I was having fragments." "Yes." Zuri was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on the table. She had a particular stillness that he was only now recognizing as something trained rather than natural. Or not trained exactly, but developed. The stillness of someone who had learned to wait out uncertainty rather than move through it prematurely. "I've been thinking about it all afternoon," she said. "The feeling I had this morning." She looked at her hands. "With you." He said nothing. "I don't think you're a stranger," she said. "I thought you were at first. I thought you were just a man from Seoul who needed somewhere to be for a while." She looked up at him. "But that's not what you are, is it?" This was the moment. He had rehearsed it, not out loud, not consciously, but in the tilted room at night when sleep was slow. He had found himself running through versions of this conversation, all of them inadequate, all of them either too much or too little. There was no clean version. He had known that for a while and had been avoiding the confirmation. "No," he said. "I'm not a stranger." She held his eyes. She was steady, genuinely steady, the woman who had corrected a nurse's medication schedule on her third day and had gone back into a burning corridor without hesitating, made of something that did not rearrange easily under pressure. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He started with the simplest fact, "You're my wife," and let it sit in the air between them before he continued, because some facts need room before you can build on them. He told her about the gala, about the fire, about the sequence on his end as he'd experienced it. He told her about Hyun's voice in the earpiece and the decision he'd made based on it and what he'd found when he got outside. He told her about the ring and the 11 weeks and the police and Oh Gyung-soo and the sign-in sheet at the Mapo Community Center with the health worker's note in the margin. He told her about Chungmu Medical Center and the social worker and the file that said settled, happy. He told her about arriving in Haydam and standing on the western path in the dark, looking at the light in her window and not knocking. He told her about the fence and the nets and the harbor work. He told her about going back to Seoul and what had required it and why, and what he'd done there and the shape of it all. He told her about the ring and its inscription. He took it off his finger while he was talking, set it on the table between them, and let her look at it. She looked at it for a long time. He did not tell her everything about the syndicate, not because he intended to hide it permanently, but because there was a sequence to the truth, and this was the first day of it. And overloading the first day was its own kind of dishonesty. What he told her was that his work operated in complicated territory, that she had been part of it and central to it in ways he had only understood by going through her files after she disappeared, and that the full accounting of that would take more than one conversation. She would know everything. He had decided that in Seoul, going through the files, seeing the scale of what she'd done and the invisibility she'd accepted, there would be no more invisible. I was done with that architecture. When he finished, the kettle had gone cold, and the light outside the window was fully dark, and neither of them had touched the tea she'd made. She was looking at the ring on the table. "How long have you been here?" she said. Her voice was even, not cold, even. The voice of someone processing something very large through a very precise instrument. "About 5 weeks total," he said. "I left for 11 days to handle Seoul. I came back." "You didn't tell me who you were." "No." "For 5 weeks." "Yes." She looked up at him. He had been in rooms with dangerous people, people who carried weapons and the intention to use them, people who had looked at him across tables with every conceivable variety of threat. He had never felt as exposed as he felt in the look she gave him across that small table. "Why?" she said. "Because Min was right. Because you had a life here. Because the woman who answered that door 5 weeks ago had built something real, and I didn't have the right to walk in and hand her a stranger's identity and expect her to feel things for it." He paused. "And because I was afraid." She said nothing. "I'd spent 3 months being certain. Certain you were alive, certain I'd find you, certain that finding you would be the end of the problem. I got here and I understood that I had no idea what I was supposed to do, that my certainty had been a substitute for actually thinking about what I'd done and what it had cost and what I owed. He looked at his hands. I stayed because I needed to be near you. I told myself it was to protect what you'd built here from the damage that was happening in Seoul. That was true. It was also true that I was not ready to have this conversation, and I stayed in that unreadiness longer than I should have. She let out a breath. It was not the release of someone who has received good news. It was the breath of someone who has received something true. The fire, she said. You thought I was out. Yes. You weren't choosing her over me. No. I was making a decision based on wrong information. I was choosing to help someone who was dying in front of me because I believed you were safe. He paused. That decision still cost you everything. The reason doesn't remove the cost. She looked at the ring again. She reached out and touched it. Not picked it up, just touched it, one finger on the surface, the way you test something before committing to it. I've been having a feeling, she said, for about 2 weeks, like standing at the edge of something. I keep thinking it's about the ocean, but that doesn't fully account for it. She paused. I think it's been this. He said nothing. I don't remember you, she said. I want to be clear about that. I don't remember our marriage or soul or any of the things you've described. I have a feeling of recognition that I can't source, but that's different from memory. I know. So I need you to understand that I can't. She stopped, started again, more carefully. Whatever comes next, it's not a return to what was. I'm not the same person who married you. I don't know if I'll become her again or if the memories come back as information about someone I used to be. I don't know yet. I know that too. She looked at him. The look had changed again. Not the evaluative look, not the look from across the harbor, but something more direct, more uncomfortable, more honest. Then what do you want? He thought about this carefully, because it deserved care. I want to tell you the truth, he said, about who you were and what you did and what I failed to understand about it for years. I want you to have that regardless of what it changes. And then I want to be available for whatever you decide to do with it. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the harbor moved in the dark, the boats knocking softly against the dock, the sound of the village settling into its nighttime. Someone walked past on the road below, footsteps fading. She picked up the ring. She turned it over in her fingers the way he had turned it over on the night they'd pulled it from the corridor, reading the inscription on the inside. She read it. Her face did something he couldn't fully decode. Not grief exactly, not recognition, more like the look of someone hearing something said in a language they're in the middle of learning, comprehending it imperfectly, but comprehending enough. She set it back on the table. Not tonight, she said. I need... She pressed her fingers against her forehead briefly. I need tonight. Of course. He stood. She didn't stop him. He picked up the ring and put it back on his finger and walked to her door and opened it, and then she said from behind him, Dojin. He turned. She was still at the table. Her hands were flat on its surface, her eyes steady, the complete composure of someone who has been through something that required everything and is still upright. I went back in, she said. During the fire. Min told me, the supervisor's account. She paused. I didn't leave. I went back. Yes. She looked at him. That's who I am. Yes, he said. That's exactly who you are. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she turned back to the table and he walked out into the cold dark of the coastal night and stood on the path outside her door with his hands at his sides, and the ring on his finger and the harbor below, and the specific feeling of a man who has told the complete truth for possibly the first time in his life and is now standing in the aftermath of it, which is not comfortable but is absolutely necessary, and is the only ground that anything real can grow from. The memories came back over the following 3 weeks. Not all at once. Not in the cinematic rush of a single, overwhelming moment. They came back the way the tide comes back. Incrementally, persistently, covering ground that had been exposed, and then retreating slightly, and then covering a little more. She would remember something specific, a sound, a texture, a sequence of words, and she would come to Min, or she would come to him, and she would say, "I need to talk through something," and they would talk it through. He was present for all of it that she allowed him to be present for. Some of it she processed with Min alone, or with the coastal walk and her own thinking, and he respected this with the discipline of a man who understood, finally, that respecting a person's process is not passive, but is in fact the hardest kind of active support. The memories of the syndicate came back in fragments that she sorted with the same methodical intelligence she'd applied to everything else. She remembered the files. She remembered the letters. She remembered specific conversations, including several where she had suggested things to him that he had received as his own insights. And she remembered watching him not register what was happening and deciding not to name it, and she remembered why. She named it now, sitting at her small table or walking the coastal path or standing in the net house after the children had gone. She named everything she'd held invisibly for 6 years with a directness that was neither angry nor excusing. She described the choice to remain in the background as something she'd made for reasons that had made sense at the time, and she described the ways that choice had costs she hadn't fully accounted for. And she did this without asking him to agree with all of it or disagree with any of it, just telling him the true version. He listened. He asked questions when he didn't understand. He did not defend himself, which was difficult in a specific way, because some of what she was describing was his failure to see something that had been directly in front of him, and some of it was her own participation in an arrangement that had kept her invisible. And the two things were both true simultaneously, and he had to hold both of them without collapsing either into the other. It took 3 weeks, and it was not finished at the end of 3 weeks. It would not be finished for a long time. They had 6 years to go back through with accurate instruments, and that was its own kind of labor. The conversation about the syndicate happened on a Thursday evening in the 4th week, at her table again. The same table where he'd told her who he was. He had been preparing for it, not rehearsing. He had given up rehearsing early, but preparing, which meant being honest with himself beforehand about what it contained, what the full shape of his life looked like when seen clearly. He told her. The organization, its nature, its history, its operations. What he had led and what decisions he had been complicit in, and what he had and hadn't sanctioned over the years. He told it without the kind of framing that asks the listener to arrive at a predetermined conclusion. He told it as information and let her do what she wanted with it. She was quiet for a while after. Then she said, "I knew most of it." "I know you did. I knew it and I worked within it because I thought I could." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I thought the work I was doing was making it function more humanely. The letters, the support for families, the decisions I was steering from the side." She looked at the table. "I don't know if I was right about that. I've thought about it, and I don't know." "Neither do I," he said. "I've thought about it too." She looked up at him. "What are you going to do with it?" He had thought about this. He had thought about it in Seoul, and on the drive back, and in the tilted room at night, and while mending nets. "Change it," he said, "systematically. Not overnight. Organizations don't change overnight, and pretending they do is its own kind of dishonesty. But there are things I can restructure, things I can stop, directions I can stop authorizing that have no justification except inertia." He paused. "I can also be honest with myself about what can be changed by one person from the inside and what can't. I haven't been honest about that." She was looking at him carefully, the same look from the dock but longer, going deeper. "You're different," she said, "than what I remember. The memories of me that are coming back are accurate," she said. "I know. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm saying you're different from the person in them." She paused. "The fence, the nets, the shelves, the way you listened just now without once trying to manage what I was going to conclude." She shook her head slightly. "That's not the person I remember." He said nothing. "Something changed you," she said. "Losing you changed me," he said. "Finding you and not being able to simply take you back changed me more." She absorbed this. The coastal quiet was around them, the sound of the water below, the nighttime village doing its small sounds. "I'm not ready to go back to Seoul," she said. "I know. I'm not ready to resume anything. I need—" She thought about how to say it. "I need to understand what I'm going back to before I go back to it. Not what it was. What it's going to be." "That's fair. And I need to know that what I do, my thinking, my work, my contributions, are visible, that my name is on what I build." She said this without heat, as a condition rather than an accusation. I was invisible because I chose it, and because you didn't look hard enough to see. I won't do either of those things again. No, he said. You won't. She looked at him steadily. I'm not forgiving you tonight, she said. I want to be honest about that. I don't have the full shape of everything yet, and I won't pretend I do. I'm not asking for tonight. I know. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, the way a door opens when someone inside decides the person outside has stood in the rain long enough. I'm saying it because I think you need to know what the actual situation is. Not the version where I've forgiven you and we resolve everything cleanly. The actual version where I'm still figuring out what I feel, and that's going to take the time it takes. Yes, he said. I know. She put her hands on the table, pushed back her chair, stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark harbor for a moment, and he looked at her back, at the green jacket that she'd gotten here and that had no history before this place. And he understood that this was who she was now and also who she had always been, and neither version canceled the other. She turned around. There's a ceremony at the school next week, she said, for the reading program. The children are going to read aloud in front of their families. I've been preparing them for 2 months. She paused. I want you to be there. He looked at her. Not as my husband, she said. They don't know that. As the person who built the shelves that hold the books. She held his eyes. You can earn the other thing in time, but you can be there next week as that. Yes, he said. I'll be there. She nodded. Something settled between them. Not resolved, not finished, but present in a new way. The way a thing becomes present when both people stop pretending it isn't there. He left her house and walked down the western path to the harbor road. The night was cold and clear, the kind of clear you only get by the coast, where the air doesn't have the city's interference. He stood at the bottom of the path for a moment and looked at the harbor. The boats, the water, the dark line of the ocean beyond, going all the way to somewhere else. He thought about the ceremony the following week, and about what came after it. He thought about Seoul, which he'd have to return to eventually, not to resume, but to reconstruct. And Zuri had said she wanted to know what she was returning to before she returned, which meant the reconstruction had to be real, and had to be visible, and had to be something she could see clearly when she was ready to look. He thought about the Second Horizon Foundation, which was the name that had come to him in the tilted room one night. Not as a concept he'd designed, but as a recognition of something that had been in Zuri's work for years, the letters and the support and the careful attention to people who existed in the margins of his organization's operations. He was going to build it formally, with resources, with her name on it from the beginning. Disaster relief and literacy and long-term family support, the things she had been doing quietly for 6 years, given institutional form and honest attribution. He would tell her about it when the time was right, not tonight. He walked back up to the Yoon house and up to the tilted room and sat on the edge of the bed and took off his shoes and set them side by side on the floor. He took the ring off his finger and held it for a moment, and then set it on the windowsill where the harbor was visible below. The ceremony was on a Wednesday. The net house had been cleared of its working equipment and set up with chairs. Small ones in the front for the children, regular ones in the back for the families, which filled up with mothers and fathers and grandparents, and at least 2 older siblings who had clearly been told to attend and were making peace with it. The books were on the new shelves along the side wall, organized by the children themselves according to a system that Zuri had let them develop, which meant it was not alphabetical or by genre, but by some other logic that was fully coherent to the people who'd made it. Dojin arrived and took a chair at the back corner. He wore the clothes he'd gotten in the village, working clothes, nothing he'd brought from Seoul. He sat the way he'd learned to sit in the village, which was without the specific held quality that Seoul had put in his posture, slightly more at rest. The children came in and found their seats, and there was the chaos of small people who are simultaneously nervous and excited and trying to remember what they're supposed to do. A girl in the 3rd row had the beginning of a speech she'd memorized and was running it silently with her lips. A boy near the front kept looking at the door, either for his parents or because he was considering escape as an option. Zuri came in last. She looked at the room, looked at the families, did a quick assessment of who had and hadn't arrived, spoke briefly to one of the mothers, and then moved to the front. She had no notes. She spoke to the children first, directly, by name, one sentence each. Something specific about each child that was not generic encouragement, but actual observation. To the boy near the front, she said something that made him stop considering the door and pay attention. To the girl with the memorized speech, she said something that made the girl's shoulders come down from around her ears. Dojin watched from the back corner. She looked briefly toward the back. She found him. She gave him nothing performative, no smile, no nod, just the look that confirmed he was there, and then she turned back to the room and began. The children read. Some of them read badly, and some of them read well, and all of them read honestly, which is the only thing that actually counts at that age. The difficult boy read a passage he'd clearly been working on for weeks, slowly, but without stopping, all the way through, and at the end of it, he looked up with the expression of someone who has just discovered something about themselves that will stay with them. Zuri said, clearly enough for the whole room to hear, "That's how it's done." Just that. The families applauded. Someone in the back was crying, which was fine. Someone in the back is always crying at children's events, and it is always appropriate. When it was over and the families were gathering their children and the room was full of the particular happy noise of a thing that has gone well, Dojin stayed in his corner until the crowd thinned. He was not in a hurry. He had learned not to be in a hurry. Zuri was talking to the last family, a grandmother who was saying something at length, taking Zuri's hand in both of hers, saying it with the emphasis of real gratitude, and Zuri was receiving it without deflecting, which was itself something, because deflecting gratitude is a habit that some people carry for years without examining. When the grandmother left, Zuri turned and walked toward him. The room was almost empty. The children's chairs were being stacked by two of the fathers who'd volunteered, and the sound of the chairs and the harbor outside were the room's only noise. She stopped in front of him. She looked at the shelves, then at him. "Good shelves," she said. "Good readers," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I remembered something this morning." He waited. "The skyline. At night, very high up." She paused. "I was standing at a window and you were behind me, not touching me, just there. And I said something about the city and you said something back that I can't quite hear yet, but I remember the feeling." She looked at the shelves again. "It was good. What I felt in that memory. It was real." He said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. "I'm not ready yet," she said. "I want to say that clearly, so there's no ambiguity. I know. But I think—" She pressed her lips together briefly. "I think I will be. Eventually." She looked at him. "I think there's something to be ready for." He held her eyes. "Yes," he said. "There is." She nodded once. Then she turned and began helping stack the children's chairs, and he moved to the other side of the room and helped with the larger chairs, and they worked in the same space without speaking, the way two people work who have been in the same room long enough to know each other's rhythm without negotiating it. When everything was stacked and the net house was back to its working shape, she picked up her canvas bag from the hook by the door, and he held the door open and they walked out into the early evening of Haydum Village. The harbor below, the boats, the smell of salt and cold water, the last light going slowly across the surface of the sea. They walked down the harbor road. Not together exactly, close enough. Neither of them said anything. The village sounds were around them, the ordinary sounds of a place at the end of its working day. And somewhere up the hill, a door opened and someone called a name, and the called person answered, and the door closed again. At the point where the road divided, east toward her house, north toward the Yoon house, they stopped. She looked at the harbor. He looked at her. "Same time tomorrow?" she said. It was about the program, the afternoon reading session, the ongoing work, the ordinary continuity of a life that was being built in increments. But it was also something else, and they both knew it. "Same time tomorrow," he said. She went toward her house. He stood at the fork and watched her go. The green jacket, the canvas bag, the walk that was purposeful without being hurried, until she reached her door and went inside, and the light came on in the window on the left side. He stood there for a moment in the cold. Then he turned and walked up to the Yoon house and up to his room and sat on the edge of the bed. He picked up the ring from the windowsill where he'd left it that morning and held it in the light from outside. The harbor light, the early stars beginning, the cold, clear coastal air. He turned it over, read the inscription. He put it back on his finger. Below the window, the harbor was dark and the boats moved softly, and the ocean went out to the horizon and past it. Somewhere in Seoul, the Beko Syndicate was running and things were being handled, and the reconstruction he'd set in motion was moving forward at its own pace. Somewhere, paperwork was being drawn up for a foundation that would carry two names when it launched, because one name had never been enough, and he was done pretending otherwise. All of that was real and would require attention and would have its own difficulties and costs, which he would deal with when they arrived. Right now there was this: the room, the window, the ring, the harbor below, and across the village on the western hill, a light in a window where a woman was doing whatever she did at the end of her evening, remembering incrementally, building herself back towards something, not hurrying. I was not hurrying either. He lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and let the day finish itself around him. And the last thing he thought before he slept was the simplest thing: that tomorrow she would be there, and he would be there, and the work would continue, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. Outside the window, the harbor went on doing what it had always done, receiving what came to it, returning what it could, moving always, going nowhere, which was not emptiness but its own kind of faithfulness, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that simply continues, that is there every morning without being asked. The light in the window on the western hill stayed on a little longer than usual. Then it went out, and the village was